Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final day of our Keep the Conversations Going festival. The last 3 days have been great, and we'd like to thank everyone for getting involved and making donations. Kicking off our last day, we have Dr. Elo posting a presentation on social media and live video for artists. Then expect to hear from Sarah Hoover, Lucy Ryan, and Nora Ivers. And finish off our day's events will be a panel on reopening entitled Are We Back Yet? Today is going to be an exciting day, and we're all really looking forward to these conversations, but we'd still like to take this time to ask for your help. This is, as some of you are watching already know, a part festival ideas and part fundraising event. That being said, we'd like to ask for your help. A donation of whatever you can afford will go a long way to helping us keep the conversations going. You can help us by checking out theatremaker.ie/donate. Thanks so much in advance. Make sure that you get involved in our social medias, ask questions throughout the day for our guests. First off, let's head over to Dr. Elo and his presentation on social media and live video for artists. Dr. Elo has a doctorate in sustainability management and is one of the foremost educators in live video production. Take it away, Dr. Elo.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Dr. Elo, your content creation doctor. I hope everybody's doing good today. I'm going to talk a little bit about live video and how artists can actually use that live video to promote themselves, to do their shows, etc. Oh, let's get started. The first thing we want to talk about is why live streaming is a must do in 2021. So people don't think that TV is that important anymore, right? So only 42% of people hold on to cable subscriptions so they can watch actual live TV. What is live TV? For me, live TV, it's watching this, YouTube, watching anything on my cell phone. So for me, live TV means whatever I can grab at the moment that I can grab it. So I can't carry a TV around everywhere, so might as well. That's not live TV for me anymore. So while TV viewing is going down, live streaming viewing is still going up. So in households with streaming devices, viewers spend 19% of their TV viewing time streaming content. So it's going up. So to get their entertainment, people are gravitating more and more toward live streams, right? Like this one. But live streaming isn't just about entertainment. It's extremely beneficial to your business. It's like content and marketing plan, etc. So 92% of marketers who use video say it's an important part of their strategy, right? 80% of consumers would prefer to watch a live video than read a blog post from their favorite brands. So how do you prepare for a live stream as an artist or as anyone? The first thing you get to formulate is a plan. How are you going to do it? So if you want people to watch your stream, you have to go live at the right time. So what is the right time for artists? I don't know. You got to decide what's the best time for your audience. You have to do an investigation of how does that work, right? So if, for example, for my show, what I have is I know that there are people traveling from 4 to 5 p.m. home. So I wait till 6 p.m. So then people are sitting down. I don't know. Maybe they're sitting down on the couch and they have their cell phones in hand and at least trying to watch it during that time. So I get more engagement or at 4 p.m. or at 6 p.m. And there's a lot of stuff you can use to get that information like vidIQ, TubeBuddy, and other tools. So it's out there in the internet which times are better for you. Now, you got to find your niche. So, what will your live stream be about? Obviously, it's going to be about art, right? So, a lot of people do gaming, music, sports, IRLs, and even e commerce. For you guys, you have to do something that's artistic, right? Like a show, like painting, anything that involves art. And you got to take into consideration that those topics take time, right? You have to develop your art, develop your plan, and it will take you a lot of time to do it, especially while you try to incorporate some subtopics in there. So a perfect example for art, it's there's a program called, let me check here. It's Artificial Remote Intelligence on Twitch. It's like a series, and it's acting, live acting. So if you go to the Artificial Next Twitch channel and go check it out, you know what I mean. It's a really it's a really unique program. It's like having a have you seen those novellas? Like people like, your mother watches or your grandma watches. So it's like a real live novella on Twitch. And this is, not everybody does it and it works pretty well. So they have seasons and everything else. So it's a matter of being creative and doing what nobody else wants to do or is doing, right? All right. The next thing that I want to talk about is you got to define your audience. Who is your audience? It might be difficult to know what to stream about if you aren't sure who your audience is. Who is your avatar? Who are you talking to? Who are you providing that value to? You got to find out, right? So maybe you've decided you want to live stream yourself watching paint dry, which that shouldn't be a thing. It's just a joke. That's definitely a niche topic, but who will watch it? I definitely won't watch, paint drying. That's pretty boring. But there's people that actually do like it. So if you can't define your audience, you can't create good content. That's what I'm trying to say. Set goals. So it's hard to measure success if you don't set goals. Choosing your goals isn't always intuitive, especially if you're unfamiliar with the territory you're going live to. So a good example for streamers is aiming to broadcast at the same time every week, eventually increasing their broadcast frequency. My times are 6 p.m. every Wednesday and Thursday. And I mean 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time because I live in the States. I know for you guys, it's 5 hours after. So it's around 11, I believe, for you guys, right? It's really late, but for us, it's not that late. And promote. Nobody's going to watch your live stream if you don't tell them about it. So this tips, there's a lot of tips that you can use to promote your streams, your live streams. But the best ones is go on social platforms like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, do Instagram Reels, do anything that's out there in the interwebs, like we call them. So promote it at least 24 hours before, and then promote it 30 minutes before you go live. So people are aware that you are actually 30 minutes away from going live, and then you're really near to starting the show. So that's a good practice. At least from my perspective, that's what I use, and it has worked phenomenally. Right. What is a basic streaming setup? The first thing you need, it's a camera, right? People need to see you. Choose a camera that's proper for your, your niche or your whatever you're doing. For me, I have the A6100 with the 60 millimeter lens, which is pretty wide. It gives you a wide view so you can see my background and see anything else. But I'm like a talk show. I just sit down and use it like this. Now, if you're further away, you can try to use a 30 millimeter lens or even, a bigger lens. So the wider, the better for this type of a show that I do. It all depends on what you're doing. And if you need something that encompasses a little bit of the whole area, right? And you have multiple people in there, you might need a lens that it's static, that it's not just auto focusing on each face that you see. So it depends on the situation, but you need a good camera at least to do your shows, right? A microphone. I love using microphones that are not condenser type, that are microphones that are targeted that I can speak to because it doesn't take all the surrounding sounds from the rest of the room. So if I talk to it here, that's how it works. If I talk to it here, you can tell it's less sound. So for me, this is the best one in this situation. Now, there's shotgun mics that are being used for art forms, right? for dancing, for singer songwriter, for everything. There's different type of microphones. You get to study the situation to see what's best for your situation. Streaming software. Right now, there's a plethora of streaming softwares. You can use cloud-based like Raystream or BeLive, or you can use a software-based like Ecamm or Mac or vMix or PC, which that's what we're using right now. So there's a plethora of there's lots of them out there. You got to choose the perfect one for your situation, for your budget as well. And there's always OBS, which is free as well. So there's lots of it. Now, good internet connection. I cannot stress more. This is one of the most important ones right here. So, internet, at least for a small show like mine, which is a one person, 5 to 6 megabits per second upload. That's the minimum. Please don't use anything that's related with the Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi works perfectly when you're on your cell phone, you're listening to music. But when it comes to a show and a production, wires are better. I know they're messy, but they're definitely better and they're reliable. So try to have your computer connected so you can actually go live with a reliable connection. All right, let's continue down to the platforms. Where do I go live, right? So YouTube Live, you can find streaming of all kinds in YouTube Live. But, there are platform specific tips to keep in mind. Like, for example, it's a lot of educational tips, a lot of how to, a lot of behind the scenes, that type of stuff. But YouTube is pretty general. Anyone can do YouTube, and it's it's not there's nothing wrong to put out in YouTube. There's nothing censored in there. That's bad. Let's put it that way. As long as it's PG-13 content or something like that. But then you got Facebook Live. Going live on Facebook is perfect if you already have a decent following there, right? If you have a bunch of friends, like I have like 2,000 and some friends in there, so it's a good practice if I just can go live in there. And it's it's kind of natural for going live on Facebook because once you go live, your friends get those notifications, and you see people that you usually talk to on the platform anyway. So it's like talking directly into them to them instead of talking to people that you don't know. So Twitter Live. If your live stream will be about breaking news and updates, this is the platform to use. Twitter. Now, I used to stream to Twitter. I didn't get a big following because obviously I wasn't talking about breaking news or updates. But people that do, oh man, it's a really political platform. If you want to talk politics, that's the place to go. And Twitch Live, which is for gamers, artists, singers, etc. So I gave you an example before of the artificial remote intelligence show. You have singer songwriters in there. You got people painting. You got everything that you can think of related to art or the art form. That's where you want to be. So, in my opinion, for artists like you guys, Twitch would be the perfect platform to do anything that's live. Now, if you want to do anything that's video related, you will jump onto YouTube or Facebook and then upload there. But keep your shows on Twitch, at least the live portion of it. Right. Creative, I mean, not everybody loves to be in camera, right? So you can use like Mixcloud, like for music and DJs, still artists. So if you want to live stream or start your own radio show or your podcast, then you'll fit right into Mixcloud. Um, Picarto is a platform where artists can live stream while creating their work for supporters to watch as well. And this one you can actually watch this one, not like Mixcloud. So if you're an artist looking to an established network to broadcast to, then you may find it on Picarto. Now for business, let's say that you have I don't know. What can I think of? A painting business, and you want to do painting or showcase your paintings, right? Then you can go into LinkedIn Live. LinkedIn Live is the best place to do professional live streams. It's on a professional network. At least, nowadays that's considered a professional network site. So LinkedIn Live is only a few years old, but live videos already see more views and engagement than native videos. So there's a lot of there's there's a lot to do in order to get a LinkedIn Live account. It took me about 4 months, and I'm telling you, 4 months of pinging the people responsible for giving me the live. So I was really buggy, and I'm glad I was. I was on there every single day, and yeah, it's very beneficial. At least if you are thinking about your art as a business itself, that's a great place to be as well. So e-commerce, Amazon Live. If you do, I don't know, stuff that you sell, like paintings that you sell anything that you've done, you can go to Amazon Live and do, the live streaming. If you're a registered Amazon seller, you can broadcast live promotionally content to help boost your sales. You can do that as well. But not only can you do sales like that, you can also just use one of the platforms like Be Live and do sales in that form and sell from your website itself. So, not necessarily Amazon is the solution. There are places where probably sales work a little bit better. You can also stream to your own website, like for example, for Theater Maker, right? You can have a window in there where you can actually go live and people can see your live production on your website. So that's another idea you can use. But I recommend if you do that, you can mix it up with different platforms as well. So, and that's where we go into multi streaming. So stream to multiple platforms at the same time, like for example, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and your website. That's a multi-stream. There's a cloud-based set of services like Restream that you can go to various platforms at the same time. But if you're starting off, start with one. Start with the one that you think it's better for your art form, right? For the best that it's better for your business. And after you continue with that one and you see the growing, then you can do that multi streaming. And the only reason I'm saying this is because you don't want to separate your viewers, right? So this is the basics of how to go live, what to think about, why is it must do in 2021, and I think it's a good time to take questions if you guys have any. All right. If I don't have any questions, this has been amazing. That is really cool. I hope you guys come in and donate. To keep the conversation going, like we say, right? So thank you very much.
Welcome back to the Keep the Conversations Going Festival. We want to send a massive thanks to Dr. Elo for joining us. I know it's really early over there in DC, so we really appreciate you helping Theatre Maker out and helping out our viewers, hopefully. Now we're just going to hop back into the Theatre Maker archives with Professor Brian Singleton speaking about Irish theatre in an international context. But before we do, we received a couple of donations, so we'd like to take this moment to thank everyone who has pledged their support for us thus far. Thank you, Joseph Clock in San Marcos with €40, Catherine in Dublin for €20, and the Isaacs Network in Wexford with €100, Vengeance in Bognor Regis with €50, Janice Barnes in Georgetown with €100, Rodo Villalobos in Lima with €100, and an anonymous Cork donation with €20. And now for our interview with Brian Singleton.
We are thrilled to be joined today by Professor Brian Singleton. Brian is the Samuel Beckett's Professor of Drama and Theatre and the Academic Director of the Lear Academy at Trinity College Dublin. A former president of the International Federation for Theatre Research, Brian is author of over 100 books, chapters, articles and essays, and an expert on interculturalism in theatre. He's here to speak to us about international influences in Irish design and the scholarship that supports this. Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Kelly. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's
just wonderful to have you.
Well, it's my pleasure.
So, Brian, in your work as an educator, you've brought international theatre practices to students in Trinity and the Lear. Why do you feel this is important?
Well, I felt as it was important right from the period when I was a student, and that's many decades ago. I studied, you couldn't study drama in Ireland at that time. I went to London to study drama, and I was exposed to so many international experiences. Obviously, London Theatre in particular, the National Theatre, the Royal Shakespeare Company, it was, they were performing all the time. So that was like a level of quality that I thought was extraordinary. But it was the international companies that came in for festivals. Those are the companies that I remember most. There's the Rustaveli Theatre from the Soviet Republic of Georgia, doing a production of Richard III, which I'd never seen anything like it in my life. And I also saw Beijing Opera, Peking Opera. Again, it blew me away. So
what was different about those productions? What was it that you hadn't seen before?
Well, it was. I'll include a third one, is Ariane Mnouchkine's theatre, Théâtre du Soleil in Paris. That it was, there was the language obviously was different. It was in translation. Shakespeare was in translation, but they all had a freedom, a physical freedom. The actors seemed to have that, and also they transplanted their productions into various designs that I had not seen. I mean, they put saxophonists on the stage in Georgia. It was a blend of kind of jazz and theatre, and it was a mixing of forms. And also with Mnouchkine, there was a live percussion, with the percussionist responding to the actors, and the actors responded to the percussionist. And also those actors I saw in Paris were athletes. They were athletes. They could do triple somersaults and jump. It was do the high jump and act as well. So, I mean, I was seeing all that when I came to Dublin 30 years. It's exactly 30 years ago when I came back to Ireland to work at Trinity. That was part of the job spec, was to bring in international theatre into the education. So off I went. They gave me some money, not a lot, but I went to India for a while and worked with the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. They organised a lecture tour for me, and in response, they brought me to theatre companies all over several places in India, and they performed for me. I had these personal performances for me,
Wow.
and then they gave me videotapes. So I took the videotapes back home, and this was the first time, pre-internet, that students were able to see what was going on in other countries. And then
That's
the
amazing.
following
And
year,
what do you think what was the benefit of those students seeing those performances, do you think?
well, I think,
For example, the Asian traditional theatres of Manushkin, what was the benefit of that for them?
well, Manushkin based all her work on actual study of No and Kabuki and Kathakali and all those theatre forms from the East, and then created a kind of fusion theatre. And that we because we'd never seen it before, it was all very exciting. Now, politically today, you can't really do that. But it was, for me, I studied Kabuki because of Manushkin. I studied No because of Manushkin. I went to the source and
Wow.
studied the source, and I trained as a No performer. I trained in 2 roles in Tokyo, and I can't do it
What
now.
was that
It's
like, Brian? What was
yeah,
that
it was.
like as an
I
experience?
I worked well. It was a reciprocal arrangement. There was a theatre director very well renowned for his productions of Beckett. He was the Japanese director of Samuel Beckett, and we had a relationship with him through a Chinese design teacher, Chisato Yoshimi, who worked in Trinity College for about 20 years. So a lot of what her influence very much influenced students, and so we got a Japan Foundation Artists Fellowship, both of us, being the director, and I went to Japan, and the 2 of us studied with a No sensei, a No teacher, one of the top No teachers, literally in his house. He had a No stage in his house, and we went there every morning for 3 or 4 hours and trained in 2 roles. And the idea was to come back to Dublin, and the Japanese director, would direct 3 short plays by Yukio Mishima, who was a 20th century novelist who actually wrote modern no plays. So we did that, and that was for the opening of the Samuel Beckett Theatre. That was the very first show in the Samuel Beckett Theatre.
Wow.
So I produced that.
That's
I was a
some
producer.
opening. That's incredible.
Yeah. And there are people that you'll know. Kira O'Callaghan was in it, and Jason
Wow.
O'Mara, who's now over in Hollywood. These were the students of the day, and they were in the show. So it was they learned new forms. They met different directors and their methods, and also the design was completely different. They hadn't experienced anything like that before. So it was very minimalist, and we were obsessed at the time in the early 90s with realism. And this took the world into a whole new level. It also we were reading plays which were not formed in the Western model. It wasn't. Aristotle hadn't. It wasn't Aristotle influenced. They were very much rituals, ritual dramas, and so I got. I mean. If you look at Irish theatre, particularly at the work of Yeats, and I studied his plays, I've been in the National Library and looked at everything he's written about No theatre, and he's actually drawn the No stage. He really understood No theatre, and about several of his plays are No dramas, in all but name.
I didn't know that about Yeats. That's very interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so for me, it was not just a case of looking at Asian cultures and showing students what they did and how different they were to us. I was actually showing them to see how they related to what we did, and how in the past our predecessors, theatrical predecessors, actually understood these things as well. And of course, we've tended to forget that, because we've tended. Irish theatre has always been considered to be kind of kitchen sink or cottage drama. It's telling the family story, and for family, read nation. It's about the nation, and so these the No dramas, they they kind of dispel that myth. They're completely they're based literally on rituals and transformation. And so I was teaching
So
in
they kind of
the
shake that kitchen sink notion up a bit, do they?
yeah. I mean, there's always a character who comes in from another worldly character, and I'm thinking here of Kathleen Houlihan. I don't know if you know the play, where there's where the old woman who comes in, a strange old woman who literally comes into this domestic drama where the sons are going off to fight for Irish freedom, the four green fields of Ireland. And in comes this, and the mother doesn't want them to go, but in comes this ethereal old woman, and she lures, like in Ratcatcher, like lures them away. So this is very similar to the No structure
Okay.
of someone from another world who comes in to dance out the trauma, the contemporary trauma, and also the trauma of the past. And for Yeats, that was colonialism, and then the play resolves when the young men go off to fight for the four green fields. So this is all
Wonderful.
Japanese. This is Japanese,
Yeah.
but nobody talks
Yeah.
about it in those contexts. So I
No,
in the
okay.
in the 90s, I did those productions, but set it in kind of at the No structured stage, gave the students the formula of No, and taught them the footsteps, etc., etc. And then, of course, they made it their own, but it helped with understanding the structure.
Yeah, so Brian, like from our chat there now, it's very
Mhm.
clear that you go away, you travel around the world for your line of work. You studied in the UK, but why is it important for you to bring back, everything you've learned and live and work in Ireland?
Well, there's a pragmatic reason, and then there's a personal reason. The pragmatic reason was I got a grant to do a PhD, and the condition was, this is from the Education Board of Northern Ireland, and the condition was that I would come back and work at home. Now,
Right.
I'm from Armagh, so it didn't quite work. I'm 80 miles away from my home, but I came back to Trinity. So there was always that condition. Of course, nobody ever expected that you would do that. But for me, it was very important. I wasn't sure. Like I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and there weren't the opportunities to teach at university. There were very few opportunities. And in fact, there were none, and for a period of time in the 80s, because there was a huge recession in Britain. And
Yes.
so in '89, suddenly all these jobs appeared. I had got a postdoctoral fellowship from the British Academy, so that was to train me as a lecturer. So I took that to University of Glasgow, and that's where talk about design. That's where I encountered live art. They had a festival of live art every year, and I saw the most amazing things. I took my first year students in Glasgow into the most experimental shows that really blew their minds. And the good thing was, it wasn't me with knowledge telling them about it. I was just like them. I was like a big kid, like them, going in to see something that
Yes.
played with
There's nothing like
perspective.
seeing it firsthand.
Mhm.
I think reading from books can only give you so much, but witnessing it is something that is very visceral, and it tends to stay with the person. So I
Mhm.
think I think it's one of the
So
best ways to learn is to go and
I
see.
do. Absolutely. And when I was in Glasgow, I took the students to everything that could possibly take them to. And I had worked prior to that at the Citizens Theatre in Glasgow. And the Cits at that time was extraordinary. They were renowned for revamping the classics and doing something really, I mean, their design was incredible. But it was live art, actually, that really brought me into new dimensions of what theatre meant. And so when I came to Trinity, they asked me to, well, first of all, teach theory. There was no theory. So teach performance theory, but also to bring in an international dimension. And the course that they told me to teach was non-Western theatre. And that's it. Many of my graduates and people probably, that's what they referred to. That's how I was known. It was non-Western theatre. Now it's a term you don't use anymore. Some people call it world theatre. Right? Even that doesn't mean anything. So now I don't teach it as a separate item. I blend it into everything else. It's just one aspect of, because the students now are on the internet, they can see all these things at the same time.
Yes.
They can see them before I see them.
It's a lot more accessible now, isn't it, to see world theatre, thanks to, as you say, the internet.
30 years ago, I was the purveyor of knowledge. I was the conduit of the knowledge of Asian theatre to students, whereas now I'm not that. Technology has taken over that role. And so what I do is kind of mediate. I mediate their perceptions and try and get them to see things in different ways. So it's a different way of teaching. It's much more enjoyable, actually. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Brian, as we engage with international designers more and become aware of the work of, say, Castellucci or the post-dramatic theatre, do you think we're beginning to approach design differently?
For me, it was essentially postmodern theatre or post-Brechtian theatre. Brecht already, changed theatre to show us, and for political reasons, to show us the machinery of theatre and not get caught up in the illusion. So that had an impact on certainly on a lot of young companies in Ireland, like Theatre Club in particular, Force Entertainment, who do a lot of their work in Berlin as well. In English, I saw them in Berlin. I spent a year in Berlin 2009-10, watching all of this work at the Hebel am Ufer, which is the How at the Schaubühne. Lots of microphones, bare stages, and it was so the scenography was actually the machinery of theatre. That was the scenography. The characters introducing themselves. I'm an actor playing the role of, and after a year of that, I came back to Dublin, desperately wanting a good story. Just give me a good story and characters, and let me just be swept away with it. But it's actually, I love both. But I came back, once I'd evened off the experience, I actually love both. With Castellucci, Romain Castellucci came, I think, 3 times to Dublin with his different productions, and he's very much a designer, but a philosopher, a very interesting political thinker. And he has his own laboratory, and with most of his children involved in it. I think his daughter's now running the laboratory, which is essentially a big white barn, and he gets all the kids to paint it in whatever. It's to stimulate their imagination. But his shows are very, very philosophical in a very, very visual way. And we had 2 of the shows in the Beckett Theatre, and there was one in the O'Reilly Theatre at Belvedere as well. And he is interested. He's cutting edge. There's one show, the last one, Tragedia and Gonidia 4. He didn't. It was contemporary tragedy. And the place or the performance started off with a static robot on stage, dressed as a kind of little Michelin man. And a live baby sitting all on its own on the stage.
What?
200 people facing this.
Oh,
and
nothing
happened. Absolutely nothing happened, except Castellucci was controlling the robot. So if the baby moved, the robot would move. And the baby would interact. Some babies interacted with it. It was a different baby each night. But some spectators couldn't handle it, and they walked out because they didn't understand there was zero risk, because their parents were literally a few inches away.
Did the baby cry or give out at any stage for being on stage?
I was part of the audition process, actually, because I was head of drama at the time and at the Beckett. And Castellucci and I auditioned babies. We had something like
hilarious. What was the criteria? What was the criteria?
Chilled out babies, just I think
Chilled out babies.
totally
Yeah.
chilled out
No,
babies.
no,
Yeah.
no drama king or queens, just
No,
people who were content.
and most of the
Babies who were
five,
content.
the six shows, was it seven? There's only one who was a little bit anxious on the night. Most of them, they were laughing and chuckling away, and even one of them
Wow.
acknowledged the audience. They thought the audience was great when we were lit up. And,
That's brilliant.
he was literally pushing the boundaries of acceptability, what the audiences can take. Because
Yes.
that scene was over, and then there was another scene of a policeman in a almost like childlike costume of something you'd buy in a fancy dress shop, with a rubber truncheon. It wouldn't hurt anyone, and he was almost play beating someone, and then had a whole canister of fake blood, and he would beat the prisoner a few times, and then spray the blood on the floor. And the prisoner was writhing around in the blood. It was more like a choreographed dance, actually. And it really
Yes.
wasn't. I mean, it was just violence which was kind of dissected. So you couldn't see it as violence. It was just
Yeah.
post-traumatic.
Was it very
right?
shocking? Was it very shocking to the audience at that time?
What was shocking was Castellucci, who was in the control room. Every time the actor beat the prisoner, and sometimes he didn't. You could hear that it was rubber and it wasn't hurting him. You could hear that.
Yes.
But Castellucci pressed a sound cue, which was a loud, and he put the loudspeakers underneath the seating bank, and literally everything just reverberated.
Okay.
And he kept doing it until somebody walked out. That's what
So was that his aim? Well, right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
At what point?
Wow. He was very, very experimental. Then he liked to. It seems like he liked the shock value. Did he?
It was a commentary on on content on the internet. People watch the real stuff quite a lot, and it's uncensored. Whereas he was showing on stage completely fake. It's totally unrealistic violence.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't actually any violence, and yet that's what people walked out of. And when it's not violence,
it's amazing though when you take away the screen. It's almost when you're watching violence on a screen, you almost feel like there's that extra layer between you and the violence. You have that in a theater, and that layer is taken away.
It was Hitchcockian. It was like Hitchcock.
Yes.
Without the Hitchcocks, without the soundtrack, the birds wouldn't be as scary. Really.
Yes.
Well, they might be. But and then one of the final scenes I remember, there was an old man with white hair, and he was clearly at the end of his days in a bed. And then just over this period of about 4 minutes, 5 minutes, he's sitting in kind of lying in a bed with a head in a pillow with the covers up. And then very slowly he just sunk into the bed, and the blankets and the pillows just all went flat, and he disappeared into the bed.
Wow.
It was an illusion. Well, actually, no, it was a sunken bed. Like he sunk underneath the into
the mattress, or was it under?
No, there was no mattress. It was just literally the mattress was just lowered very gently until there was a flat line, and it was kind of you've seen the flat lining in a hospital. When someone's heart stops, you get the flat line on the monitor, and this was a visual flat line of the person just disappearing into nothingness. And he was gone.
Wow.
That was the end. It was the most extraordinary thing I've seen. One of the most extraordinary things I've seen.
Wow. Well, obviously all those images that he presented have stayed with you. So he's a very effective designer then.
Yes. I think it was all of the imagery had such an effect on everyone, and including me. It was the violence of the sound, not the visual violence, that was affecting, and it just made me think more. It made me think more about what I'm watching on TV, and what is it that's making me feel that way? What is it? And is it the violence? there's a lot
Or
of
is it,
violence
or
in
as you say,
TV.
or is it the sound? Is it the sound, like the unease of hearing? As you said, wasn't it underneath people's seats it was coming from?
Yeah, yeah,
Wow, amazing.
absolutely. So literally, our whole bodies were shaking. So the sound was creating a movement in us. It was like an earthquake, and there's
Wow.
nothing as elemental as an earthquake. So
No.
it was pushing theatre to those boundaries, but he's got a very political consciousness. He's really
Yes.
looking at the contemporary world and forcing us to look at the world and hold a mirror up to the world, and also look at how we accept one thing but don't accept another, and how we're kind of, we glibly ignore some violence and yet are horrified by another form of violence.
Yeah.
And his view is we should be horrified at it all. But
At it
we're
all,
not.
yes. Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Oh,
Being an island, we don't have easy access to the work of Complicité or Minushkin. And our references are, I suppose, they're usually Irish and maybe sometimes British. But in the last 20 years, thanks to companies like Pan Pan and the Dublin Theatre Festival, there's been a greater intercultural exchange in design. Can you talk a little bit about that, Brian?
Yes, I mean, it actually goes back further than that. It goes back to the 80s. There were many practitioners who went abroad to study, to the École Jacques Lecoq, and latterly with Anne Bogart, for instance, in New York. And all of those people came back and started experimenting in, I'd say, the early 90s, which is about the time that I was starting in Trinity in 1990. Pan Pan emerged in I think it was 91 or 92. And they were, the graduates of ours who really were experimental, like this, really avant-garde work. And they took their work to Europe, and this was something unusual. Most Irish work prior to that would go to the UK, to Anglophone world, to London, or Glasgow, Birmingham, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, to the diaspora. Whereas this company went to Poland and Germany and places like that, that wasn't a traditional route for Irish theatre. And of course, they brought back the influences from all those places, and it was very different types of theatre that they brought back.
Would that have been seen as quite a risky thing to do?
At the time, yes. But for me, we hosted the first couple of international symposia that Pan Pan did. So people registered for the symposia, and there were workshops from visiting companies and performance and visiting companies, and a lot of dialogue. And I remember that, I felt that's the sort of thing we should be doing. I was a young lecturer, and I thought, I didn't see anything risky in this. There's no risk in this. This is we're in a place of education. These people are at the beginning of their career, and they're experimenting. And what is theatre apart from experimenting and creating something new rather than recycle the old? And so it was risky. It was experimental, but what they did was they attracted a new audience. There was an audience for that.
Yes, and it was a risk that paid off very well for them.
If you look at companies like Rough Magic, who've been around since, well, they're my generation, actually. If I had gone to Trinity College, I would have been in the company of Rough Magic people, because exactly those years they were at Trinity. And their audiences are now, they've grown up with them, and they're now, when you go to a Rough Magic show, it's a much older audience, but it wasn't 30 years ago. It was much younger. And so each generation needs it has and new theatre emerges. And I remember seeing, before I went to London, so I was quite young, I was a teenager, and I saw a really exciting new company called Druid. It was wonderful. I'd never seen anything like what they'd done, and I thought, wow, that's really impressive. And that was really original what they were doing. It was so earthy and so gritty and realistic, and it wasn't played for laughs. And it was just that was edgy. That was a risk.
Yes.
Everything new is a risk, and so Pan Pan, I think probably it was the first big international, first big risk of an international perspective. I think they marked that. Now, but of course, we had all the way through this, we had the Dublin Theatre Festival with various curators bringing in shows from all around the world. And so, you know, our Beckett Theatre, we've always been a host for at least one or two shows, and we've always tried to program the edgy stuff. We've always tried to get the directors to program the edgy stuff that our students would be interested in. Usually they do. And also, the other big thing that happened in the 90s was the Dublin Fringe Festival. There was, in the early 90s, there was nothing for my students to go to, really. It was when Rough Magic came to project.
Well, the Dublin Fringe Festival really prides itself in pushing boundaries and being experimental.
Absolutely.
And it's just been
Absolutely.
such wonderful work from across all platforms in the arts over the last few years.
And that emerged from a young company called Bedrock with Jimmy Fay, who's now director of the Lyric in Belfast. And he did a lot. His Bedrock's early work was all international plays that we would never get to see at the Gate or the Abbey. And this was, I mean, with themes and designs that were experimental, and there was a big push to move out of theatres and into non-theatre spaces. And once you go to a non-theatre space, then the old division between audience and audience and actor is broken down. So you can experiment more with form, and it's about the experience. I mean, theatre's about experience. How do you experience it? And if some people like to experience it as part of an evening out with a meal and a glass of wine, and just sit there.
On that note of experiencing theatre, we're obviously going to be experiencing it in a very different way at the moment. The International Federation for Theatre Research recently posted from their postcards from lockdown, with academics all over the world reflecting on the changes that we're going through. How has theatre scholarship been affected during lockdown?
To be honest, it's hard to know just yet. I think, I think we were all in a state of shock and a state of mourning, because the subject that we were teaching, because we're teaching the next generation, and suddenly, where's that next generation going to go? Where's the present generation going to go? And what is the new form that's going to come through and survive this? And so I think a lot of people were in shock. But I was reading those postcards, and I know most of the people who wrote them, and they reflect differently what's going on nationally rather than internationally. Although it did have an impact. The Black Lives Matter movement had an international impact all over the world, even though it was very much. It was an American major phenomenon in America. It impacted the discourse here and all over the world. And then a lesser known subject that's going on at universities in India is the crackdown on any kind of critique of the government. And there's huge problems in some of the universities there. So they're dealing with their own battles at the same time as COVID is raging around the world, So the politics, in the absence of theatre, there's a greater focus on the political and the political context of how we're consuming what we're doing. I think, I do Zoom with quite a number of people and Skype or whatever, and around the world, and I do get a sense of that something new will emerge, but we don't yet know what it is.
Yes.
So all we could talk about is the conditions of existence. What are our conditions of existence?
Yeah. Do you feel that online performances could affect change politically or otherwise?
I think, well, yeah, technology always affects change because, technology can create wider reach. If you look at, I grew up in a world without mobile technology or internet technology. I grew up in a world where there's a question I asked my students last September. I said, when I gave them a project to do, and they said, "Oh, we'll create a Facebook group." I was, could you just leave your phones down for a minute, right? How do you think students did this project in 1990? How did they communicate? Try and think of
Yeah.
ways of doing it without. And so, once I hear Facebook mentioned,
Did they struggle? Did they struggle with
Hmm.
that, Brian?
They haven't
Yeah,
clue.
yeah.
I talked about all the notice boards weren't for us giving information about classes. It was all this. We had a notice board where students just posted notes to each other on it because they had no other way of connecting. They had no phones, and
Wow.
and that board was just a smorgasbord of inter-student interaction. I'm not saying we should go back to that, but I do get depressed when I hear about Facebook sponsoring this, that, and the other, or Facebook is giving an artist €1,000 to create some, because what that does is turn artists into content creators.
Yes.
And that really angers me enormously.
It can actually stifle creativity as well, that kind of sponsorship. Yeah, it can, because it often has to fit within certain criteria when they do that.
It certainly does. And but on the other hand, I'm not knocking technology. On the other hand, I have had lots of experience as being a spectator using all the technology with actors in different places in the city, and I'm talking to them on mobile phones. I can see them. I can track them on GPS in front of me on the screen. I know where they are. They can send images of where they are in the city. I can give them directions. There are so many ways that we can create interaction and dialogue between performers and audiences using all this wonderful technology.
And it has certainly helped during this pandemic as well, hasn't it? It really has helped us.
The problem was lockdown, because lockdown forced us into our bedrooms. Really, we communicated in our bedrooms, and that's it was. I was looking at all the Dear Ireland videos that the Abbey commissioned, and it was such relief when someone was walking on a beach, and an actor was in the shower
outside,
or cleaning a window. I mean, it was just such a wonderful release and relief that you can create theatre. You don't need four walls to create theatre.
No.
It's we try to box ourselves in, and I think possibly the theatre of the immediate future is thinking beyond the walls of theatre. Because there will be social distancing. It'll probably come down to 1 meter. It'll expand and contract according to how prevalent COVID is in any city. And so if, I think the bigger theatres are going to have the bigger problems with filling the seats. They need that return in order to pay for the big production. So possibly a kind of smaller scale micro theatre, interactive micro theatre is the way to go. The other thing I watched was Lock-In. I don't know if you saw Harry the Rookie Lock-In events. This was live theatre.
I love Howie the Rookie, but I didn't see that event.
It was performed once a week, and I think it's still on. Maybe no, I think it's finished now. But they performed, I think it was every Thursday night, live, straight to camera, and in a TV.
Great idea.
In a studio, and you literally, it was a theatre. You paid your money to get the key to access the theatre, and then what I loved about it was great performances, but and I knew the play inside out, so there was nothing new. I think actually there was something new. The actors were different, and they created different aspects of the characters. But what was wonderful was to see the labour of the actors. You could, 30 minutes into a monologue, the actor was sweating. To see the actor sweating, whereas pre-recorded theatre,
it was up close and personal.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
pre-recorded theatre, film, TV, all of that disappears because it takes time. Everything is stretched out when you're recording. Whereas live theatre, it's live labour, and the sweat, of, the blood, sweat, and tears, it's live in front of you on the screen. I love that. It was great to see it. That's the first time I'd seen it on theatre. I've watched a lot of live streaming of shows. I wanted to see Fleabag. I hadn't seen it. The play, Phoebe
wonderful.
Waller-Bridge.
Phoebe Waller-Bridge, yeah, amazing.
Yeah, and it was really wonderful to see it.
Yeah.
But it was almost too perfect for me, just from a visual perspective.
It's funny, I'm actually also looking forward to watching. My husband and I are going to sit down and watch Hamilton as well. That's just come on Disney Plus, so we've got a date to watch that because we've seen it in the theatre and we're eager to see how it'll be different to watch it as a filmed production. But it's funny because there's a lot of people who are struggling, out of my theatre friends, who are struggling to watch theatre on a screen as opposed to, sitting down in the theatre. How do you feel? Like, would you be in the same boat, or do you think you actually enjoy it?
I would have been in the same boat 4 or 5 months ago. I was always resistant to live streaming into cinemas. The National Theatre London or the Met New York, live streaming into cinemas. I was so resistant until I was dragged along to a National Theatre production of a Noel Coward play featuring, I can't remember now, Andrew Scott. I wanted to see Andrew Scott.
Oh, Andrew
because he won the Olivier Award for this particular show, and he was extraordinary. And what those live streaming is I found interesting because they give you the sense of theatre. Like, you go as you're settling into your cinema seat with your popcorn and everything, you are listening to the settling in of an audience as well on the screen. And you get added value, like you get an interview with the director, or you might get an interview with the actors in the interval, in the spaces that they leave, which you wouldn't get in theatre. And I think that live streaming needs to have added value. It needs to have something else and give us greater access to the people who are working, who actually create the show, not just directors, but I love listening to actors talk about their work and as part of it. So I'd seen that and I thought, wow, I'm definitely going back for the next one. Definitely go back to the cinema for the next NT Live. Unfortunately, there wasn't one because it was COVID. But now, of course, we're kind of forced into this. And I do think live performance, where you see the labor of the actor, where you see the skill, the talent, and it's not hidden by technology, etc. It's just literally bare in front of you. And then you see the actor in the dressing room coping with a 15-minute turnaround and having to get probably a new costume and whatever. You see that if you get a glimpse of backstage, and which you wouldn't see in the theatre, it's the added value. Go back behind the scenes and show that as well. Now, obviously, there's lots of things you don't want to show going behind the scenes, but there's certain things that you can.
Oh, definitely, there are certain things that have to stay behind the curtain, aren't there, Brian? So, Brian, I have a question for you about our current situation. So, how has our current situation broken traditional boundaries of the four walls of the theatre, and how will that influence theatre going forward, do you think?
Its influence is to close the theatres completely. I think going forward, I think theatre always mirrors the existence. It mirrors what we're doing, and I think I was reading online about an opera company in Madrid. They staged an opera where that only required a small orchestra, so they could spread out the small orchestra in a large pit and keep the social distance. And then the actors, of course, in opera, when you're singing, there's a lot coming out of the mouth that could be potentially dangerous. And so the soloists were all spotlit and socially distanced, and they created social distance into the dramaturgy of the presentation. Singers were singing to each other, but not actually beside each other. And that, for me, that's actually really interesting, because I teach, and one of my courses is visual communication. And what's more communicative, what's got greater communicative value, is when the spectator completes the image. If you give a whole image, we just take others, we recognize it. But if you don't complete it, if you take an element away from it, you're forcing us to complete it. You're making the audience more active. And I think social distancing, you see it around, people have invented, elbow.
Yeah.
This is a new sign. I never knew this meant something.
Yeah.
This is a new
elbow,
sign. So we got all these new,
it's the new handshake, isn't it?
And there's the other gesture when you go to hug and then you stop. It's almost like pouncing. I'm seeing all these new gestures that are happening, and that might be a new vocabulary for us in the theatre. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we've developed a new vocabulary, and then the Zoom vocabulary. With all these teleconferencing applications now, there's a kind of performance is going on in terms of raise hand, can't hear you, and literally we're literally talking isn't enough anymore on this technology, that you have to use other things, either mechanical hands or your own hands. So I think it will influence how we receive theatre, and also in terms of how it's created. I think we're going to have a lot more work outside, because the risk is less outside. The audience doesn't have to be outside. The actors could be outside, and the audience inside. Well,
if we were outside, we definitely have to bring our umbrellas. We don't have the the joys of having Mediterranean weather.
No. Well, even that's fine as well. But you just reverse it then. The actors are there, but we're not allowed in. There's all sorts of ways of playing with it. But we'll see what the rules are for theatre in terms of social distancing. I reckon it'll come down to 1 meter. But what do you do? I mean, blocking off every third seat, is that the way we want to go? What if you go in a group of 6? Can those 6 stay together? I don't know. I think having a sparsely occupied auditorium is even more demoralizing for performers than having no one there at all.
Completely. It's a much harder work for them to create that atmosphere.
There's no atmosphere.
Audience members who are who would be attending.
So you've got to rethink that. We've got to rethink how the audience is experiencing it, and what they're contributing to the performance. And it may not just that they're in the theatre, or there's a mixture of both. Like I'm planning my teaching for September, and for seminars, like we're with 2 meter social distancing, it's going to be hard getting the whole class into one room. And so I was thinking of alternating each week of half at home, half online, half in the room. And then some lecturers are saying, "Oh, but you need someone to operate the computer for you." And I said, "Well, no, you don't. You just simply you don't distinguish between who's live and who's not live. If everyone's sitting with their laptops or their phones live in the room, and everyone at home is with their laptops or phones live, we're all connected, but we're not actually in the same space. And it's thinking around, how do you get more people into the experience? So think of it rather as an experience more than as this is an audience and this is what audiences do. I'm being fascinated with. I'm doing a lot of research in the last few years about the end of the 19th century in Paris, and some of the things that were created there for entertainment. This is the era of the waxworks. People going in to see not kings and queens and emperors and what have you, but they would recreate scenes of murders that would be in the newspapers, and people, so
Right.
they'd be visualized. People were going to see them. The Paris City Morgue was a huge attraction. Can you believe it?
I did
Massive
not know
attraction.
that. Oh,
It used to be
wow.
behind
People really
Notre
do
Dame.
have morbid curiosity, don't they? They really
Well,
do.
yeah, this is interesting because it was behind Notre Dame. I went there 2 years ago to find it, and it's not there anymore. It's just concrete. It's a concrete park. But this was the site of
Okay.
the city morgue. It's in the middle of the river, the island in the middle of the River Seine. And they had, what they did every day was, if there were bodies would turn up without identification because people were flooding into the city for work. They didn't have IDs the way we would have, and if they died, they didn't know who they were. They didn't know who these people belonged to, and so they would, like a shop window display, have a curtain, like Brian Thomas, and with curtains, and they would display the bodies, and it was really for identification purposes. So people would go, and
Wow.
if they'd lost relatives, go and see if they were
They would
in the
go and
windows. But
see.
it got to the
Okay.
point where it became a form of entertainment, but really bizarre, macabre entertainment. And then if there were no bodies on a particular day, there were riots because there was no experience
Yeah.
for the people. And
Yeah.
so there's all sorts of things that we think of as experiences, and rather than as constructed performances. And there was on the Seine as well, just not in the river. There was a wonderful contraption, a mechanical boat, where the Seine is a river, and like it's not the sea, but you had a boat beside the river, and you'd pay money, get a ticket, get into the boat. Then the boat would set off, wouldn't go anywhere, but it would rock and buck and kick, and water, jets of water would come at it, and you would get the experience of being on a boat in the sea. That was another one. And I mean, there was all of these wonderful, wonderful experiences were
Yeah.
popular forms of entertainment, and we've lost them all. We put them into
Yeah.
fairgrounds and we've considered them for children as opposed for adults. Immersive theatre is possibly, it's here already. It's been here for quite a while.
Yeah.
For over the last 10 years. But sometimes, like a lot of, I've written a book on Anu Productions' work on the Monto cycle,
Yes.
where a lot of that took place in the street. Where half the time I didn't know, I know the actors now, but at the time I didn't really know the actors, and I didn't know whether it was an actor speaking to me or it was a member of the public. I didn't know how to react. And then when I came out of the show, when the experience finished, and I wasn't sure whether it had ended because I'm standing in the street thinking, it's not over. And I watched everything as performance.
Yes.
And also at the end of each show, because we were all individuals, mostly individuals or in pairs, we would get together at the end. Because I would see these shows multiple times, and I always this desire to find out, what did you see? What did you experience?
Yes.
And so these
Because it
little
was probably
communities.
different for everyone and different every time it was performed as well.
Absolutely, and they sought on different routes, and experienced it differently. And then there were like performances just for one person that no one else saw. So there was this sharing of the
Wow.
experience that happened. I stood for hours one day on Foley Street, just chatting to complete strangers. And in fact, I walked with Laundry, which was set in the Sean McDermott Street Laundry, the last one to be closed, the Magdalen Laundry to be closed. I walked back with a man. There were three of us. There was a woman who was very upset by it, and she was in a caravan that they had. She went in for a cup of tea and
Yeah.
a box of Kleenex, whereas she clearly had a relationship with the material
Yeah.
that I didn't have, and or I now know I do have, but I didn't actually know. And then
Okay.
I walked into town with a spectator, and I chatted all the way into town, and I talked about Laundry and over again, and I'm still talking about it 9 years later.
Yeah. Wow.
Because
It really does
it
bring
has,
audience members together.
I think,
And perhaps that's what we might miss if we keep to the screen. If more theatre companies do take risks and broaden their horizons and do promenade pieces like that and site specific, where we can social distance, that sounds like it could be a good, alternative to being in a space.
I think the encounters, how you encounter it is one thing, but how the community feeling, when you're sitting in a theater of 400 people and there is a ripple of laughter that goes through the audience and it's infectious.
Yes.
And it's that community, even if you don't laugh yourself, you feel it and you feel part of something. And you lose that when the spectator's on his or her own. And but what I found is that what it does is increase the desire to communicate with total strangers. Whereas when you go to a theater of 400 people, if you're on your own, you just go home. Or you might, if you're with someone, you might go for a drink. But you stay within your unit, usually.
Yes.
And but with this type of performance, you actually want to come together. It increases the desire to come back and actually have a chat about it. So I think if it's online, we need the chat facility. We need to be able to communicate or not just chat on the screen, but have multiple devices. And we're all sitting at home watching TV with scrolling our phones, and we're doing and the doorbell rings, and then the microwave pings. There's all these things going on at once, and we've got I used to hate it because of that I was one image, one moment, whereas now we live in a kind of multi-image world where we can read text at the bottom of the screen and we can watch 3 different people do 3 different things and scroll our phones and have a conversation with our family beside us.
It's all about multitasking now, isn't it? And being able to do that. Yeah, completely. Brian, I have one last question for you, and it's actually I have to say, I confess, it's shying a little bit away from theatre, but it's a guilty pleasure that I think we share. I hear that you are a fan of the Eurovision Song Contest and that you have been going to it for many years, and talk about design and it being an absolute field day for any designer. When did your love of the Eurovision start?
When I was 8. I was 8 years old.
When you were 8.
And I saw Sandy Shaw for Britain. Was it 68, 67? Sang Puppet on a String. And so I watched. I wasn't allowed to stay up for it, So I'd see the clips during the day, or on the news the following day. And but it was when I was allowed to stay up for the first time after Dana won. She won in 1970, and it came to Dublin, the Gaiety Theatre Dublin, and I was allowed to stay up. And there was a woman performing. The winner was from Monaco and singing in French. I can sing it if you like, but I won't. I just gone to secondary. I just switched to secondary school, and I was learning French from a native speaker. It was an experiment in the North at that time. They were putting native speakers into classes, and so we never spoke a word of English in a French class. And then suddenly I saw on TV for the very first time someone singing in French, and I knew the words, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. It's a spectacle, and it's glamorous, and it's wonderful, and I love this. And I fell in love with it, and then I actually was pushed into writing about it. So one of those many essays and things that I've written is several of them. My most downloaded essay of all the things I've written is about the Eurovision Song Contest.
That's so funny! Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Well, it just shows you how much of a wide reach the Eurovision has all around the world.
But it's also, with Terry Wogan's commentary, it got into a bad place because he was so negative about the so-called voting blocks in the East. As I was starting the scholarship in around 2004-05. I started going to the shows. So the first one I saw was the 50th anniversary concert in Copenhagen, which all the stars from the past were there. And of course, I was in the second row. It was heaven. They were sitting beside me. It was absolute. But you were in the
second row.
Yeah, and
oh my goodness, great seat.
That's the power of being a fan and knowing people. And then I went to see the contest in Athens and Serbia and Belgrade. And I went to, if I got accreditation, so I was able to go behind the scenes and saw it being put together, and was in all the rehearsals for it as well. So I got a sense of the construction around it, and
Yeah.
how it's not just a song. It's much more than that. It's several months of communication to an international audience.
Yes.
And probably the most exciting one of all was in Moscow, because they had virtually 2/3 of the world's LED on the stage, and that was a spectacle in itself. So
Wow.
yeah,
Yes.
so I mean, I
Amazing.
nearly ended up going to design school. I was useless at art at school. I gave it up after 3 years, and but when I was studying theatre, I took a module in design and absolutely loved it. And so the design teacher was trying to send me on to postgrad in the Wimbledon School of Art, because they did a particular theatre design course at that time. So I could have gone down a different track, but I'm a very visual person.
Yes. So it would seem that you're attracted to all the different kinds of visuals, all of that the world has to offer. We've just had an absolutely fabulous chat. I feel like we could go on for forever. We've gone from babies on stage, the Eurovision.
Yes.
We've talked,
which didn't happen. The Eurovision didn't happen. No.
I know, that was so sad.
Mhm.
We talked about world theatre and the future of the Irish stage. But thank you, that was amazing. It was just an absolute honour and a privilege to chat to you today. And thank you so much for joining us here on Stage Door Live.
Well, thank you, Kelly.
Sorry,
I mean, this is the first time I've actually had a proper talk about theatre with anyone, so for quite some time. And it's an absolute pleasure to meet you, Kelly.
It was absolutely wonderful to chat to you. Thank you so much.
Now it's time for Dr. Sarah Hoover's talk on theatre and game studies. Please send in your comments and questions on our social media, and we'll get them straight through. And take it away, Dr. Hoover.
Thank you, Michal. Yeah, I'm delighted to be chatting with everyone today. I have more of a provocation, I think, than a presentation, but it's something that the pandemic has really focused my attention on, which is the idea of interdisciplinarity, and that we as theater and performance makers are never skilled in just one area. We really have to be expert thinkers and doers, analysts, researchers, makers, all of those things. And I have some thoughts about it, and I have some kind of examples from my own work and other people's. So I'm really interested to hear where other people think we are in terms of supporting an interdisciplinary approach to theater and performance. Now I'm going to try forwarding this slide, and there we go. We'll see if it shows up. Yay! Okay. So just briefly on me, I am a dramaturg, a devised theater maker, a director, and a lecturer at NUI Galway School of English and Creative Arts, where I recently graduated with my PhD on effective and participatory performance structures. I'm also a gamer, a role-playing game addict from a long time back. Yes, I played the first D&D. And that does influence my thinking. It was nice to be able to come back to it from a research and a making perspective. So what you're seeing here on the slide is just some evidence of the way that interdisciplinarity is approached from a material standpoint in terms of finding capacity for interdisciplinarity, respecting interdisciplinarity as a method of working, and interdisciplinary products, cultural products, as valuable. We can see that in training in the way that many universities across Ireland talk about their theatre and arts programs, in fact, as interdisciplinary, or UCC's Centre for Interdisciplinary Research and Performance Practice, bringing together, I apologize if the construction gets too loud, bringing together a number of different performance practices to create some new ideas. We also see it in European support structures and in particularly in arts, humanities, and social science research support. And of course, in the Irish Arts Council, the Open Call initiative, supporting 4 large-scale projects for a total of €1 million that started in 2019 and continues through the pandemic. So there is some recognition that interdisciplinary ways of working and products that come from those ways of working can't necessarily be described in one of the categories that we recognize as artistic projects. But we still struggle to understand what those values are and how they can support work in a number of different ways. I also argue that, and here's my provocation, that what we talk about as interdisciplinary is often actually multidisciplinary. And I'm going to talk about the differences between those two. So my provocation, I guess, is to kind of think with me about what we gain from recognizing the difference between inter and multidisciplinary as theater makers, researchers, as knowledge producers of all kinds. Because interdisciplinary work, real interdisciplinary work, requires additional capacity to do well. So that means additional training, additional funding and economic support, resources, and career structures too. Let me shift forward here. There we go. So what's the difference between multi and interdisciplinary? I'm going to draw on some theater sources and some social science sources to argue that multidisciplinary means people from many different disciplines and skill sets who are coming together to work on projects, each drawing on their own disciplinary knowledge and expertise. But multidisciplinary projects are more transactional. They are an expert from one discipline bringing something to trade for something from another discipline. And in fact, multidisciplinary work, if you look at the way that what's called interdisciplinary is often taught, they talk about finding connections between disciplines, which is great and a worthy project and all those things. But that is what indicates to me that that's multidisciplinary. We're bringing together a bunch of people who are in their own individual fields, who are sitting next to each other and finding the places where they have similarities. So interdisciplinary work then involves synthesis, involves taking those little bubbles and moving them together. We're all accustomed now to thinking about the ways that bubbles can interact and not interact. So I'm referring to interdisciplinary as an integration of knowledge and methods from different disciplines that synthesize an approach to a project or a study or a single performance, any of those things. The idea of an interdisciplinary project is to combine the know-how, the technique of all of its members to create something in between, something liminal, something new. So what does it look like then if we think about how we value the interdisciplinary, we value that interdiscipline space? Again, I'm drawing on a number of different sources here. So people will have different opinions about what these words mean, but that is also definitely a function of working in an interdisciplinary space. We don't agree necessarily on what words mean. That's fine. For me anyway, valuing the interdisciplinary looks like recognizing the effort and time that it takes to develop that in between. There's a lot of capacity that's required to simply communicate between different discourses because we don't always use the same words, or we use the same words to mean slightly different things, because we have different expectations, because we have different experiences, different histories. We've been taught to value, to attend to different things. So we have to recognize that it's going to take some work, and we have to support that work in all of the ways that we support work. We also have to acknowledge that what comes out of it may be very ephemeral, very temporary, very liminal. It may only be a lexicon, a vocabulary that refers to that project, and that it is still knowledge production, and as such, it's still valuable. Or it might quickly evolve into something else. It might become another discourse entirely, and that's certainly of value. We also have to have that continual tension that Jill Dolan talks about between the critical and the generous, to open our minds to seeing things from a different perspective before we begin to evaluate, deconstruct, and break them down. Both of those are important processes, and we have to do both those things. But having a value for openness and for generosity towards a different discourse is predicates the entire interdisciplinary process. For me anyway, it is motivating to talk about that process as cultivating surprise. I like surprises. I think that's how we grow, and that's what keeps us moving through the world. Valuing the interdisciplinary then also looks like understanding when we need to categorize what we've done, or what we've thought, or what we've said, and when that act of categorization itself is impeding our creativity. It is sometimes useful to put things in boxes and to think about the way that those boxes relate to other boxes that we already know, and sometimes it's not. So this is where particularly theater, because it uses the thing to represent the thing, it uses the chair to represent Macbeth's throne, it uses the human body to represent the human body in a situation. We can move between and beyond that kind of categorization process to communicate something very specific and very real without necessarily using the words and images that already connect to an existing discourse. And then perhaps in analysis, we might bring it back into the boxes that we know so that we can communicate to people who weren't there what the meaning of that is. So knowing when to put things in boxes and when to keep them out of boxes, that's an important part of working in an interdisciplinary way. We also need to monitor the scope of interdisciplinary work. Anyone like me who's ever worked in an interdisciplinary way knows that you spend a lot of time getting up to speed with all of the different things that people are saying and valuing and prioritizing and doing. And then it goes off in its own weird directions, and knowing when to follow those directions and when to say, yeah, that's great, but we have a show in a month. It's part of the devising process, and it's very much a part of the interdisciplinary process. So being clear with each other or with yourself, if you're doing a solo interdisciplinary project, on what the goals of that project are. I would argue that's even more challenging sometimes working in an interdisciplinary process than it is in, say, even a normal, devised theater process. So that's monitoring the scope of the work and making sure that you are still aiming towards the things that you need to aim towards, whatever the declared aim of that project is. And here's the biggie. We need to develop the capacity to evaluate the vocabulary processes and other results of this new liminal thing on its own terms. We are creating something new and something different, but we need to speak back to the discourses that we came from, or that might find value in that work. All of these are things that we all probably do already, but working in an interdisciplinary way, I would argue, puts even more pressure on those processes. Okay, so let me talk for a minute about things to consider when embarking on an interdisciplinary project, and this comes from my own experience in reading, and I'm sure everyone out there has their own yes and also, so I'd love to chat about that. But this is kind of these are the things that I put on the wall in front of myself when I embark on a new project. Things to consider. It's not the same everywhere. Context matters. And this is something that we learn from those who work also in intercultural theater. The supposition that certain things are universal and certain things are specific is key to communication. Which is universal and which is specific is contextual. And we have to recognize the contexts from which our own presuppositions come. And be able to communicate what those might be or recognize them when something feels jarring or different. Don't assume that what we think is universal between discourses is in fact universal. Wearing lots of hats takes lots of headspace. Reserving time and capacity and resources to accomplish these things. I'm going to keep harping on this because it's absolutely necessary. Developing core goals and aims and understanding what the pain points and the promises might be. When I speak to someone in game studies and their understanding of how a brainstorming process works, and my understanding as a theater maker primarily of brainstorming, that's two different things. So knowing where the pain points might hit and preparing time to deal with those is very important. Check-in sessions. I always recommend check-in sessions. Just in case there's anything that is bubbling underneath the surface that needs to be discussed. So Hamilton here is a good example. Is the core goal of this performance, or one of the core goals, historical accuracy? How is that balanced with the need for dramatic tension? How is that balanced with the display of technical virtuosity? Those come from slightly different, at least historical accuracy and drama and technical virtuosity come from very different discourses. So knowing what's going to take precedence in what specific element of the performance will be very important. And knowing how to talk about it if somebody thinks that A is more important than B and some doesn't agree. Then building a lexicon. Again, to work truly interdisciplinarily, we have to develop a new thing. And that part of that new thing is a new vocabulary. That can be a huge contribution to knowledge, actually, is the creation of a lexicon. I have found this very useful. So this is from my own experience, not everyone will. The processes involved in what's called systems thinking can help us open a new way of processing all of these considerations, all these questions. I'm going to talk briefly about 3 different approaches that I've seen to interdisciplinary work and training as well. And then I want to get into some specifics and give you some examples. Oh, sorry, I think I was on the wrong slide for that. So there's Hamilton. All right, 3 approaches. These are, you often, if you do any research into interdisciplinary education and interdisciplinary education for arts training, these are the 3 that I have seen come up again and again. There, of course, are others. Parallel processing, cross-disciplinary processing, and infusion. So parallel processing means that each expert focuses on specific parts of the content of the project and then leads the others through pieces of that project. So everyone is assigned something that is within their wheelhouse and explains how it's going to work. And then the transitions are brought together. So we move from each piece of content to the next in an understandable way. Then you have cross-disciplinary processing, where each expert is addressing the same content, are addressing a common theme. So many devised theater companies actually work in this way. And then each person brings a solution to the same problem, and then we all look at the solution. We look at all of the solutions in total, and we see what is universal about them and what is really interesting and different about each one, and make some decisions about which ones will be solidified in the final project. Then finally, now I would argue that we're going from more multidisciplinary to interdisciplinary in this list. So parallel processing is quite multidisciplinary, where infusion would be closer to a very deep interdisciplinary process. And that's where we continually flow from one discipline to another, so that a specific concept or idea or stimulus, the whole group might move to respond to that using methods and systems and techniques that some are familiar with and some are not. And the point is that when I, as someone who is, say, familiar with traditional actor training techniques like method acting, like Stanislavski, I know those are two different things. When I approach the development of a character, then I approach it completely differently than, say, a game designer will approach it. But if we are simultaneously designing that character and speaking to each other or back and forth to each other, then what we end up with is kind of a mashup, which we have to then refine. But it also becomes surprising in its complexity, in its depth, and in the way that it references new meanings. We understand that character quite differently, both of us. So again, this takes capacity, this takes time, and this takes being able to work together, having the resources to work together, as well as just getting along. Okay, so I'm going to do a bit of a gear change then and talk more about the kinds of things I've been working on and thinking about, and have done sometimes less research on. And sometimes I feel like I've sat in them for years and years and years. Yeah, there we go, we've switched. So theater and game interdisciplinary is my thing. And particularly in my work, I'm heading towards dramaturgies of participation informed by the ways that some similar concepts are approached differently in these different theoretical and practical contexts. So what I want to think about in terms of interdisciplinary working or the interdiscipline space is using these theater and game discourses. In my case, I work particularly with live action role play or LARP techniques as sources of lexicon, of concepts, of the priorities in terms of attention. I'll talk about that more in a minute, and the methods of making an analysis. And in theater, we often talk about dramaturgies or journeys. I think of dramaturgies as journeys through the time and space of the theatrical event. Many times we talk about dramaturgy as though it only applies to the fictional event, the fictional space, and that's completely understandable, partly because analyzing the dramaturgy of an entire audience experience, from the moment they hear about a theater performance, for example, to the last time they ever think about it, that's impossible. But even to do it well is a long-term, full-time project. That's a career. One of the things I do challenge myself and other theater makers to do is to consider the audience contract no matter what kind of project we're embarking on. But in some cases, that will be more important, and in some less. Working in participatory theater, it's quite important to me. Aside from that particular journey, though, we take audiences on many other kinds of journeys through, for example, changes in the way that language is used, code switches, formal structures. We take them through changes and revelations in the way that we understand the dynamics of identity, of culture formation. We take them through changes in physicality, the relationship of bodies in space. All of these and many, many more are ways that we can analyze performance and think and talk about the direction of attention, the way that we curate and direct our own, as makers, and audience attention. And if this resonates with you, if this method of thinking about dramaturgy resonates with you, I highly recommend Eleanor Fuchs' Visit to a Small Planet, which is purely from the theatrical side. But very useful. I should also clarify that when I say dramaturgy, what I'm thinking of is a very active method of analyzing and responding to multiple modes of communication and proposing to the project different ways to understand or deepen them. I understand dramaturgy as a creative act rather than a purely analytical one. And I think that will make sense to most of the theater makers audience. So making theater through dramaturgy, making sense of theater through dramaturgy, that makes sense to me. The ephemerality of each performance's journey and the way that all these journeys together reframe or repurpose the things that are already in my head. So I'm talking about semiotics and phenomenology. Those are the key and the absolutely delightful values of theater. But because the water that theater swims in has to do with the separateness of the theatrical space and its qualities as a fiction, I think we often can't see how those operations of change, the way that we actually make the journey, the way those are saying something about the meaning of the journey, the themes of the performance. The metaphor that I use sometimes is it's like riding a bike. Once we learn how to balance, how to move our feet, and how to shift gears so the chain doesn't pop off the derailleur, which is a continual problem of mine, we tend to forget about the effort, the capacity required to make that journey, and that the functioning of our bike and the knees and the road are influenced by all of these other narratives and structures of power. Maybe the person who welded the bike frame was having a bad day, right? Maybe the weather has caused flooding over the road further ahead. Maybe the lights at the theater entrance, to shift the metaphor back to theater, are dim that day, and audiences begin their witnessing experience, their performance of audiencing, moving slowly and peering more closely at each other at an intimate distance rather than making eye contact with someone across the lobby. And how does that affect the journey through the theatrical fictional event? So, like I say, we don't always have the capacity to think about those things. But I think some fascinating and surprising things happen when we do devote attention to those layers of experience, to gears and their functions. And there are some concepts then from game and LARP design that I use to inform my dramaturgical work and that have begun in my mind to have parallel and intertwining thematic meanings when I create work. So here are some of those, in case anyone finds it interesting. I had the very good fortune to work for a little while with Brenda Romero of Romero Games. And if anyone has played Doom or Quake, you know Romero Games, as well as Paradise of Sin and all the other amazing titles they have. And I had the good fortune, I guess, of getting her mad at me for tricking her into performing someone she didn't know she had in her. She was very gracious about it. But one of the things that I learned from her, because she comes back to it again and again, are the mechanics are the message. The mechanic is the way that one moves if you think again of the dramaturgical journey from point A to point B, it's the operation of the pedals. It's the gears intersecting with the chain. Those are the mechanics. So if the mechanics are the message, then what we're thinking about is what mechanics are operating to make the gears move. What is getting people to the theater? What is getting them to a certain emotional experience or an intellectual understanding? And who has the power to operate what in what ways to create the effect? Is that the message we want? So this is one of those lightning moments for me in terms of interdisciplinarity. The mechanics are the message. The way that my audience is moving through the space, speaking to each other, making assumptions and expectations, those are all part of the performance itself. And they play into the meaning of my themes. Yeah, okay, that did shift ahead. This leads me to the systems approach to dramaturgy. And I am right in the middle of writing and thinking about this. So they're kind of mushed together in my head. And I hope I'm clear, and I hope that the provocation is successful if the education part of this is not. Game designers attend to systems a great deal because they're activating certain of these mechanics at certain times, and they want to make sure that the way those mechanics function are cohesive over time, or if they're not, then that's intentional. So systems thinking offers a way to approach theater making that in my head parallels dramaturgy, that's the mush together, but differs in some basic understandings of agency and attention that are really interesting and generative for me. I don't find them restrictive. Some other people may, and they do take time to tease out, and they apply differently to different projects. But this is an amalgam, a synthesis of systems approach, which is to ask oneself, what are the key rules of the physical world in which I'm operating? Both on the stage and off it, the physical world in which I am operating as a theater maker, and the physical world in which my characters and events and situations and places are operating in that fictional space. What are the rules of the social world? What are the rules of the economic world? What are the rules of the cultural world? And you can come up with others, of course. Then to ask what makes change in each of these systems. Who does what to make something happen? Then ask, by what rules are they operating? What assumptions are they making? Or are there physical laws that, of course, we can manipulate because it's a fictional world on stage? Which ones are meaningful to this project, though? We can wash everything in bright yellow light, but is that meaningful for this project? And again, how are they activated? How are those rules and mechanics activated? By whom, when, and why? And what tools and terms and techniques will best express those rules and express our deliberate breaking of those rules if we're going to do that? It's kind of a lot. I'm trying to break it down into something meaningful, and then I'll give you a little bit of it, some examples. And in fact, this concept, again, from game studies, from LARP studies, is one of them that initiated some lightning in my mind. And that's the concept of designable surfaces. This is a quote. What you see on the screen is a quote from Mary Flanagan, who is a game studies author. Designable surfaces is a commonly used term then in LARP design now as well. Elements of production that might be manipulated or made use of in order to create a specific experience. Great. As theater makers, we know a lot of those. We can manipulate light and sound. We can manipulate the way that characters relate to each other on stage. We can manipulate all of those rules. But to move us on to the next slide, there we go. But for example, Johanna Koljonen, who is a LARP designer and researcher herself, talks about designable surfaces as extending far beyond the fictional space that we create. So the thing you're designing is there in the middle. And as theater makers, that's what we attend to, I think, most often. But we are depending on the experience of the specific people who are coming to our performance, their expectations, their understanding of cultural norms and social norms, their understanding of what the building will look like and feel like and the temperatures that they'll experience. We're depending on those, and we can just choose to disrupt those. Those are also designable surfaces. Beyond that is our culture. And this is where it gets quite interesting in terms of a cultural studies project to understand how the expectations of audiences and theater makers in Montreal will be different than those in Belgrade, will be different than those in Hong Kong. Koljonen points out that designable surfaces all along this continuum are available to us to manipulate. The expectations of participants, their reflection on their experience and their memory of it, we can do things to trigger certain responses at certain times. So thinking beyond, one of the advantages to a game theater interdisciplinary approach to me was that I can challenge my audiences to think beyond their experience with the theater itself and the ways that their expectations coming in and their reflections going out impact the meaning of the performance for them. It seems to have been somewhat successful anyway. So let me relate that back to kind of intertwine these concepts to a concept from theater makers, which is scenographic worlding, which is a complex philosophical term, and I'm not going to do it justice. But it has to do with the way that specifically scenography, as one designable surface that we can address, intimates an orientation for the audience and for everything on the stage and everything off the stage, creates a speculative and imaginative world. We can change the idea, we can change what people think of the street outside by doing something on the stage. So the scenographic world goes beyond that stage itself. And again, this references what Johanna Koljonen was talking about in terms of the culture and the specific experience of attending an event as part of, thinking about that as part of the theatrical event itself. So I combine these two kind of concepts to think about how does the entrance to the space signal that the production team understands audience expectations, or that we want to mess with them, and that it's intentional. It's not a mistake. We mean to do it. How does the entrance reflect the way that our collective movement through space as a culture implies connection, ownership, relation? If we place someone whose clothing is very different from everyone else's in the lobby, that becomes a referent and a designable surface for our production as well. It asks audiences to think about something, to notice their own responses to their expectations being challenged. And of course, those who work continuously in site-specific and immersive work have to think about these things probably in lots of different ways. And the pandemic has raised a lot of questions for us as well in terms of our expectations. What do audiences expect now out of a performance? So we're still going to be establishing that. But here's an example of a show that I have worked on as a dramaturg. It's True, I Love You All So Much by Jenny Meekenma. This is Eva's Echo, and you'll see on your screen that I would highly encourage you to pick up tickets to that. It's the 30th of September through the 2nd of October, €15 ticket. It'll be great. This is a online event, and part of it is live and part of it is through a website, and it's all very interdisciplinary. And as its first signal of expectations, it asks you, before you can buy a ticket, to submit to the great unknown internet, the producers, what do I like about myself? So the first affordance or opportunity to act is an act of generosity toward yourself and toward this unknown fictional space. And something that simple is an indicator of interdisciplinary thought. Okay, so I see that I'm getting a little low on time, and I will jump reasonably quickly then through one of my own projects, which is Two Truths. This is a show I did a couple of years ago when we could all be together in a space at Galway Theatre Festival. Okay, thanks. I did this at Galway Theatre Festival. I also did this, versions of this, as events at gaming conventions. There was a version of it that was played for the Fine Gael Parliamentary Party. That was interesting. Yeah, the design is meant to be portable and scalable. But here you see the Galway Theatre Festival version. And I want to dig down into one specific mechanic choice that I made to help illustrate what I'm talking about in terms of interdisciplinary thinking, to the point where I can't quite determine which discourse these decisions came from. Okay, there we go. So these are the concepts and a little bit of the synthesis that I was doing in creating this project. The dramatic tension over time that I was working towards had to do with participation, and participation has to do with permission to play. And again, this is partly cultural, understanding cultural expectations. When I did this show in Chicago, it was very different than when I did it in Galway because people perceived a different permission to play. They also perceived a different agency to make changes to the performance. Even in the spaces where they are signaled that they can make changes to the performance, understanding the designable surfaces of the culture was necessary for this participation to work. I was interested in representing a real-world system in a gameful way in order to highlight that agency. And the system that I was representing was the system of the Irish politics. So the three pillars that I chose to misspell, I chose to operate under as I was making decisions about the design and the dramaturgy of this production, and three pillars working to three pillars is a game design thing, were flexibility, playfulness, and using role-play mechanics. The lexicon that I developed ended up with words like alibi, which is a LARP studies conversation about the difference between the self and the self in performance. So the character and the self, or the role and the self. One is given permission to be, to behave, and to feel and to carry the attitudes of the character. That's alibi. Affect, because I was interested in that pre-conscious, what gives us permission to feel differently. Attention, the way that the design of the space, the interaction, the instruction, all curated attention towards the interaction between the tensions within any political system, but we were looking specifically at the Irish political system. And of course, agency, the message of the performance being that in one way or another, we all have agency to affect the legislative systems under which we operate. So the evolution that I went through here was looking at what's the narrative arc I want people to perceive as they walk through this performance. Add to that from game studies the idea of a choice molecule, where I offer you an opportunity to do something, that's an affordance, you take the action, and there is a noticeable result. You actually make a difference in the narrative and the aesthetic. Okay, so if I'm going to do that, then I need characters who produce a narrative tension, who produce an iterated conflict because they can encounter each other again and again through their ways of being together and their ways of making a political system operate. This led me to the concept of axial tensions. Okay, so axial tensions, this is the little diagram that I started with. I ended up with something a little bigger and more detailed, but this is drawn from, again, LARP creators, Mo Hochler and Karen Soltis. The idea that you have characters whose motivations are in direct opposition to each other, and then you curate the ways that they must encounter each other and give and take power and be perceived by the rest of the characters. That's the concept behind axial tensions. So that gets to all of those things: affect, agency, alibi. What people were actually given then, I made a deliberate choice not to reveal this mechanic to audiences. What they saw was a very short card with a character title and a phrase, giving them a goal, playfulness. That is an example of playfulness, and providing some specifics for a win condition, which is a game thing. So for example, the negotiator needed to bring two people who are in opposition into a compromise. If you do that, you win a point. Or in another example, build a coalition that votes together. There was a vote mechanic in the game. Or I had some characters like an artist whose goal was to create a piece of visual art that represented their perception of the tension in the room. That's not in direct tension to anyone else, but it does reveal the tensions that exist because of this axis diagram. Okay, so that's the way that kind of game design and dramaturgical design came together in my head to create the mechanic behind characters and two truths. I also have a game hacker. Always have a hacker in the game. Okay, so let me kind of close with a summary and a real clarification of that provocation. One challenge in analyzing the production of two truths has been that the synthesis of language produces new concepts that are hard to communicate to either game or theater critical audiences. That's why artistic research, which is the creation of the performance and the performance itself as research, need to be valued as the production of new knowledge, which in terms of the education system in Ireland is a separate but related conversation. But we have to know that an interdisciplinary project will have to use new modes of communication, will have to use new words, will have to have different capacities to evaluate it as well as to create it. But I keep referring in my own work to Gilles Deleuze's metaphor that it's the charge between a positive earth, a positive ground, and a negative cloud that create the beauty and power that is lightning. With all its ephemerality, the fact that it is temporary makes it no less destructive, makes it no less energetic, makes it no less beautiful. Without the difference, there is none of that energy. So I would suggest that we need to consider ways to make interdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary practice valuable, to recognize the difference between the interdisciplinary and the multidisciplinary, and to be clear that it is the work itself that is the most significant value. beyond its contribution to any of the discourses that from which it arose. To me, anyway, this makes a much more generative and resilient and far more interesting space to work in. That's all I have. I think we're open to questions now. Is that right, Abby?
Questions? Hello, Sarah. I'll just keep talking just until Kevin. Hi, Sarah. Hi, Dr. Hooper. How are you doing?
Pretty good.
Good. So yeah, we're going to open it up to social media questions. I have a few of my own. This is fascinating. Absolutely. Oh, I should introduce myself. I'm Abby. I'm an associate producer with Theatre Maker. I am fascinated by this and should preface all of my questions and our conversation after with the fact that I'm an actor, not an academic. So I'm learning as we talk, and we'll be learning from your theories and from this discussion. So
am I.
Okay, fantastic. I love it. I'm finding myself connecting with what you're talking about on a personal level and thinking about my own practice in a method of, or in the ideas of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work. Yeah, if that makes any sense. It does feel quite, it doesn't feel tangible, or I can't find the words for it quite yet, but I like it.
It's usually a good sign. If we can't put words around something, it's because the intuitive mind is trying to work out what it means.
Definitely. And we've got to give the space for that to happen.
Exactly.
Fabulous. Well, I think I'll move on to a few of the questions I have, and we'll see about social media and see if they're coming up there. So earlier on, you suggested that we might not agree on the vocabulary. Would that hinder the creative process or the ability to arrive at a process that you would describe as the infusion or as the fusion of both multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary work?
I would say the short answer is yes, but it shouldn't. Our funding and training structures, and in fact our career structures, are often predicated on living in those boxes. We can more easily communicate to audiences, funders, and educators what we're doing if we use the language they're familiar with. But working in a truly interdisciplinary space often means developing new language. So being able to communicate back and forth between the new thing and the old discourses is actually a skill that teaching interdisciplinary arts practice gives to its students. And it's very useful in this world where we're all going from one language to another, one gig to another, that kind of thing.
I would consider that essential, that we develop those skills. And if we lose touch with that, then we won't be able to move forward in a progress, or maybe not progress focused, but yeah, in a growth mentality, I suppose.
Yeah, there's always, I think there's still a lot of value in trying to use the words that people are familiar with in order to deepen specific concepts for them, trying to communicate with people where they are. But I personally find myself very attracted to that energetic synthesis of the new from these disparate parts. And like you say, we can get stuck in those old languages, those old ways of talking and making and being in the world.
Something that strikes me as well is the desire to get it right, the desire to answer the question right at the top of everything, instead of enjoying the process and figuring out what things mean and giving it the space, as you were saying, that is essential to getting to where we need to be or on to the next step. which is a scary, I mean, just purely from an actor standpoint, being in that zone of possible failure or possible mistakes is where both, I would call it the sort of utopia and sweet spot, similar to the fusion aspect of the crossover between multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary work. It's something that you can't put your finger on, but you know when you're walking that fine line.
I think you hit on something really important there, which is that space to fail is often the space where we can't communicate what's going on. And so many places, so many businesses, and we hear this language of disruption and creatives and enterprise all the time in a number of different ways. We're told we need to fail faster. We're told we need to fail better. But there has to be a space in which that failure is not just acceptable, but actually supported. And I think in the pressure to produce something quickly and professionally, getting it right, like you said, we can lose that space to fail.
Do you think that the language comes first then? The seeking language to connect us in our journey, I suppose, comes first before we allow ourselves to fail? Like, do we need the words?
Good question. And I mean, not to get too academic on it, but like, there's a whole 20th century philosophical discourse about whether language comes first. I think it depends on the makers themselves. Again, this is a real value in interdisciplinarity, even if you just look at it in terms of, say, someone who is a dancer, a musician, and an actor are meeting to do a project, then the language of the actor, maybe they've been trained in method. So they know objective and they know task and they know opposition and tactic and all of those things. That's not a language that a musician necessarily speaks, but they speak a different language that may have similar concepts. And a physical performer speaks another language that also has similar concepts. So spending some time showing what conflict looks like, what it sounds like, what the words of conflict are. Those are three different ways of talking about conflict around a specific stimulus. And in that initial discussion, I think sometimes what results is a lexicon. It is a language where we choose the terms that we're going to use collectively. We have our own vocabulary. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just a performance. And I think that's the great thing about theater is that we can communicate in so many different modes simultaneously. So I guess the answer to your question is yes and.
Perfect. So it's not a matter of trying to hit the point. It's a matter of seeing where we get to.
And always pushing each other to that point where we say, oh, I hadn't seen it that way.
I think in images a lot. So this concept of trying to get to a focal point, or if you're working with a musician or an actor and let's say a game designer, all trying to get to that sweet spot. But instead of thinking of it as a point that we arrive at, thinking of it as paths that sort of align, like on a tube map, where you've got that one station that connects the three. It's just.
Ooh, I love it.
It's I work in images sometimes better than
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's it. And even that image of a tube map, like right there's all these opportunities for action, right? There's so many opportunities to turn that into a sound and the movement of an avatar from one place to another, and all of those concepts that can be expressed in different modes simultaneously through performance. That to me is the lightning, right? That's the generative part.
Definitely. Do you think it's important to understand when in a process, a rehearsal process or a design process, to understand when we're switching between modes from multidisciplinary to interdisciplinary and identifying those?
Well, that's a good question too. I think it depends on what the desired outcomes are. If you are working as, say, an academic, and you're going to have to communicate this process to other academics, then doing some reflection on how we are working together as interdisciplinary makers of a thing. If you can signal that to each other and to yourselves, that makes it easier to communicate that later. On the other hand, I have seen some interdisciplinary arts practices in particular where people just are in the same room for 72 hours and a thing comes out. And they can't say when something happened. They can't say usually what exactly it was. But they can say they're happy with that thing. That thing is what they wanted. And we're running into the difficulties of language again.
Definitely. In that model that you shared there, I can't remember who it was by, but the idea of reflection and sort of taking notes on the process that has happened. Do you think that that process can happen on projects where the awareness of the work, like between switching between multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary work, do you think that that reflection on the process can be as helpful, if not more so, if the processes aren't identified in the process? That was a bit.
I think I see where you're going. For me, anyway, I highly value reflection. My work is a lot about allowing people to reflect on their own presuppositions, the way that they are in the world, and to try something new. So for me, I do find it very useful, although also very exhausting, to switch between a being in the zone, where we're just making the thing, and stepping back and reflecting on when we left, this is your bit and this is my bit, and when it became our bit. Because then I can refer back to it later and think to myself about, did I like that? Did we find something universal? Did we find something specific to the 2 or 3 or 4 of us? Is it something I want to replicate? Or are we making assumptions about our audience, their expectations, who they are, where they come from, and what they want, that we need to reconsider? So I find that reflective part very useful. And again, I think we need to save time and space for it, because it does take a lot of effort to switch into that process. Sometimes you can incorporate it into the making process itself. But either way, I think it takes capacity.
Well, speaking of audiences, you were suggesting that that audience's experience begins at their entrance to the theater, and that the audience and the audience comes to, and the artist come to the work with not only their own experiences, but a wider cultural history. So how do you propose that theater makers or designers use that knowledge to connect with audiences?
I would say that honestly, the performance begins the first time somebody hears that the show is going to happen. The performance and their expectations start in that moment. So how do we use that knowledge that the performance begins in that moment, and it only ends the last time anybody thinks about it? One way to use that, I think, is to start thinking about the way that we go through the world in the same terms. My experience at breakfast may impact my experience of that performance. Certainly my history as a North American, as someone from the Midwest in the US, influences the way I perceive a show at the Abbey. So as theater makers, I think we need to we obviously have to make some assumptions about our audience and what their expectations will be, but we should challenge those assumptions from time to time as well. One of the best ways, I think, to do that is to go see and do other things. If you go to a lot of theater, go to some jazz music too. Go to a research seminar. See how the language and the expectations and the relations between audience and performance are the same and are different.
And challenge your own perceptions in the process.
Exactly. Yeah.
See, that's what I think I connect to most just about your talk and about these ideas, is that I think I could start to identify multi-discipline, because most artists are multi-hyphenates, right? We act, we direct, we write, maybe we do some pottery on the side. And how do we take all of these, how do we take all of these elements and turn it into a multidisciplinary art, and sort of find that sweet spot within our own practice where they all are alive and present in our creation?
And I think the first answer, we need to acknowledge that that's not always in our control. Many funding agencies will fund theater. They won't fund sonic art or destabilized, decentralized sound performance. Now, we're getting better at that, and certainly the pandemic has made all of us change the way that we approach performance and supporting performance. But we need to change as a culture, besides just as individuals.
Fantastic. Dr. Hoover, this has been absolutely fabulous. I'm just going to double check to make sure if we have any socials. I'm getting the word in my ear that we are good there. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, for just telling us about your research and what's on your mind. It's absolutely fascinating. It's got me thinking. And yeah, thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon, I'm sure.
Okay, thanks so much, Abby and Kevin and Mikhail and everyone. Great job.
Thank you. Well, folks, that was a fantastic discussion. We are going to move on to a short break until 4. We'll be starting another stream then. But right now, I want to thank a few people for their donations to our Keep the Conversations Going campaign. Thank you to Grimskull for a donation of €100. Grimskull from Evansville, thank you so much for keeping the conversations going and helping Theatre Maker. Thank you to Anonymous from Cork for their donation of €20. Thank you to Rodo in Lima for a €100 donation. Thank you to Janice Barnes in Georgetown for a €100 donation. Thank you to Vengeance, the Oscar Wilde musical in Bognor Regis for their €50 donation. The Isaacs Network in Wexford for their €100 donation. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. Go ahead and take this time to share our content, our campaign with your friends and followers and colleagues on your social media. You can also visit our website, theatremaker.ie, and donate, pledge your support for Theatre Maker, and help us keep the conversations going. And if you can't afford it right now, please share our content We would love to reach as many people as possible. All right, we'll take a short break and we'll be back to you at 4 p.m. Stay tuned.